she was left to die in a hospital emergency waiting room.
In desperate need of medical care.
Not receive medical attention for nearly a day.
Left to die on the floor of a New York City hospital.
It is not unusual at all. It is something that could have happened to any of us.
A chamber of filth, decay, indifference, and danger.
I wish I didn't see it.
I'm appalled. I mean, it is shocking. The whole community is shocked.
We don't treat animals like that, and only to see another human being like that, and people were around. Nobody reached out to help her.
It is, I believe, a problem that's systemic throughout this country and has to be addressed.
Psychiatric label, they don't have credibility.
The only one that was there for her was a TV camera. And amen for that TV camera. Because if that TV camera wasn't there, we would not have seen the graphic detail of a life wasting away.
The persons responsible should be behind bars.
Today we'll be discussing the case of Esmin Green. Esmin was a mother, a caregiver, a businesswoman, and a prominent figure in her church. She was described as being very generous, full of life, and having a voice that was memorable to many. To those who were around her, Esmin appeared to be the epitome of somebody who loved and somebody who was loved. Despite dealing with hardships at a young age, Esmin did what she needed to do to ensure that those around her were well taken care of. After moving to the States to be able to better provide for her family, Esmin seemed to be settling in and forming a great community with those she was around. But although things seemed to start off just fine, things also quickly took a sharp turn, because it wasn't long before when Esmin began dealing with mental health issues. And as her time in the States progressed, her condition simultaneously worsened. Esmin had multiple instances in which she was admitted into the psychiatric hospital, and unfortunately it became somewhat of a regular routine where she would need to be brought in, as there were a lot of concerns of what she could do to herself if not treated. And that's exactly what her loved ones thought would happen when she was again brought into the hospital on a particular Wednesday morning. But what they expected would be a routine visit to the hospital unfortunately turned out in possibly the worst way they would have expected. Because on that morning, Esmin was not only dealing with her mental health concerns, but she was also dealing with a physical health concern. And nobody, not even doctors, even knew what was about to come. Because what makes this case just honestly really sickening is the fact that Esmin sat in the waiting room of the hospital just waiting to be evaluated for over 24 hours. And it was after waiting that entire day when Esmin ended up collapsing face down onto the floor. At least 3 senior nurses, 2 security guards, 1 psychiatrist, and a nursing aide. Yet Esmin laid there face down on the floor for an entire hour, and nobody came to help her. Several people walked by. You can literally see them coming in and out of the room, and not one person decided to help. Hospital staff saw what was going on. Some even peeked their head into the room to see an unconscious Esmin lying on the floor, and they still did nothing about it. And it wouldn't be until the security footage showed what truly went on during those early morning hours, which soon would expose multiple staff members who tried so hard to cover up their tracks, all caught on camera. But before we get into this case, my name is Petal Palmer, and on this channel I post anything involving medical mysteries and crime. If that is something that sounds interesting to you, please consider subscribing if you end up liking this video. Alright, let's get into this case. Esmin Elizabeth Green was born in Louisville, Jamaica, and although her exact date of birth isn't known, based on her age when this case happened, she was likely born around 1959. Louisville is a settlement in the St. Catherine Parish and is about 60 kilometers or 1 hour drive to the capital of Kingston. This is a small place with a population of approximately 3,163 people, and it's highlighted by its very beautiful and green natural scenery. Louisville is surrounded by vast landscapes which are perfect for going hiking or on nature walks. It's well known for being home to Worthy Park and the Worthy Park Estate, a historic sugar plantation, and a rum distillery. And overall, this town just looks to be a relaxing and opening place in Jamaica's countryside. Esmin was the firstborn of 13 total children, and with being the oldest, especially with the many siblings, it was likely that growing up she played a significant role in being a role model to her siblings, or at least someone they could look up to and rely on. Her friend Peter Pilgrim described her saying, quote, "Esmin Green is a beautiful person. She has a good heart. She loved people and she loved children. When Esmin was 20 years old, her mother unfortunately passed away. And with her mother then being gone, Esmin was then left as the person to kind of take care of her family. From especially then on out, Esmin worked very hard to help raise and provide for her younger siblings. And this would be a very helpful skill set that would aid in her raising her own family. Because sometime around approximately 1977, Esmin had her first child, a daughter named Tecia, and she would go on to have 5 more children. Esmin was said to be an amazing mother who would do anything to be able to provide for her children. And her daughter, Tecia, described her saying, quote, "She was the light to us. She had a strength that drew everyone to her." During her time in Jamaica, Esmin went on to start multiple successful businesses. Over the course of a decade, she went on to establish a dress shop, she had a wholesale fishing business, and she began a small import company. Her businesses were described as doing well. But at some point in the late 1990s, Esmin had to make an impossibly hard decision. With providing for not only herself but her children, she needed to have the finances available to be able to look after anyone. Where she was at the time, she wasn't able to find opportunities where she would be able to make as much money as she hoped to be able to best provide for them. And because of this, she soon packed her bags and moved from Jamaica to New York. Esmin ended up settling down in Brooklyn, and with being in this big city, she was able to focus on better financial opportunities with hopes to be able to send more money back to her family than what she could make in Jamaica. Throughout the first years of being in Brooklyn, Esmin would get involved and take part in a variety of different businesses. She worked as a caregiver for the elderly, and she even began working at various area daycare centers for children in Brooklyn. And in doing this, she was saving up for a better living situation while providing for her children in Jamaica who were living with their aunt. Esmin was said to be somebody who pined for her children constantly. She would often wire them money, she would send them large barrels filled with groceries, and she would send them gifts during the holidays. While living in Brooklyn, Esmin became heavily involved in a church called the Jesus is Lord Sanctuary, and she got extremely close with the members there. She was known to many as Sister Green and referred to her fellow churchgoers as her family, and she felt very comforted by the friends she'd made while attending Mass. With the love she had for children, she was said to be heavily involved in the church's youth programs, and it was there where she would run various types of activities. She would even lead prayer sessions. Through this church, Esmin was able to meet other fellow immigrants, especially because the area in which she lived had a notable Caribbean immigrant population. She even made friends with a woman named Eleanor Ramsarin, who was a chaplain, and Esmin was said to accompany Eleanor many times when Eleanor gave sermons in the chapel of the very same hospital this case actually occurred in. Eventually, at some point in 2006 or 2007, Esmin actually moved in with 2 of the women she knew from the church into an apartment above the church. And although things were okay at the start, things would soon take a sharp turn for her. Now, in the early years of living in Brooklyn, Esmin in fact had been struggling a bit with her mental health. Initially, it was said to not have been as bad, but in 2007, that's when it appeared to become much worse. Starting from January that year, Esmin's roommates, church friends, and pastor Marilyn Johnson had noticed that Esmin was displaying some concerning trends as the year progressed. They were seeing that Esmin would have these long depressive episodes, and some of these episodes were lasting for several weeks at a time. During these episodes, Esmin and her surroundings would often dip into quite bad conditions. It was said that Esmin began having episodes where she would pace the floors all throughout the night, and there would be times where she would stay silent for days. And during these moments when she was feeling unwell, she would lack an appetite and start eating very little. She would often appear quite disheveled, and she would show up to her friend's door just asking if there was a place for her to sit quietly. There would even be instances where she would just grab and collect items from their home, such as dresses, plates, or valuables, and she would put these items into large trash bags and just place them out onto the street. And when she would do this, whenever her roommates would see this happening, they would call Pastor Marilyn, and Pastor Marilyn and her husband would help bring the items back upstairs. And when they would ask Esmin about this, she either genuinely could not recall doing it, and if she could recall, she would have no idea why she would have done it in the first place. In the beginning, those close to Esmin believed that she was simply homesick and that she was just desperately missing her hometown and her children. But as the months went on and the behavior and episodes worsened, it became clear that that wasn't the case. It wasn't that she was just missing home, but there was actually something very serious going on with Esmin. Between January 26th and March 12th of 2007, there were 3 separate occasions in which Esmin was admitted to stay in the hospital where this case occurred. And this hospital was called Kings County Hospital Center, or KCHC. But specifically where she stayed in the hospital was at the Comprehensive Psychiatric Emergency Program, or CPEP, where it was said she stayed almost interruptedly. And I'll be getting into it later in the video, but from this case alone and everything else I've read, this hospital appeared to be definitely not the greatest hospital, if you will. During those 3 hospital admissions, Esmin was observed by the doctors at the hospital. And during these observations, they soon went on to diagnose her with psychosis and or schizophrenia. The National Institute of Mental Health defined schizophrenia as a serious mental illness that affects how a person thinks, feels, and behaves. And the World Health Organization states that schizophrenia causes psychosis and is associated with considerable disability and may affect all areas of life, including personal, family, social, educational, and occupational functioning. It's a condition that's characterized by significant impairments in how one perceives reality, and it's characterized by changes in behavior related to things such as persistent delusions, persistent hallucinations, experiences of feeling as though your thoughts or actions are not your own, disorganized thinking, highly disorganized behavior, negative symptoms especially regarding motivation, enjoyment, or emotions, extreme agitation, and problems with cognitive or thinking skills. A lot of these symptoms were ones that Esmin exhibited. And for this diagnosis, Esmin was soon prescribed with the antipsychotic medications called Haldol and Risperdal. And she was also prescribed with the anti-anxiety medications called Ativan and Xanax. However, it was said from her hospital records from the CPEP that Esmin tended to be non-compliant with her medications. But even before her stay at KCHC in early January 2007, Esmin also had been hospitalized for depression at Coney Island Hospital. And these hospital stays unfortunately continued till the next year. On April 23rd, 2008, Esmin seemed to not be doing too well. She was walking around at a residence in Brooklyn, and she was described by a security guard as not acting right. Because of this, the security guard ended up calling EMS, and they subsequently arrived to bring Esmin to the CPEP at Brookdale Hospital. Esmin was said to be the kind of person who didn't really want others to worry about her. With this illness she was dealing with, she didn't want too many people to even know that she wasn't well. It was said that she was embarrassed about her illness, and because of this, she kept information about her illness for only a select few people to know. These people mainly included her roommates from the church and Marilyn, who was the pastor who Esmin relied on, especially for spiritual guidance. Now, throughout this time, Marilyn became very involved in Esmin's mental health and safety. During these several instances in 2007 and 2008, Marilyn would sometimes bring Esmin to the hospital to be looked after in the psychiatric unit for her own protection, and these moments would be relatively fine. But other instances were a bit less peaceful, as sometimes Marilyn would need to call 911 in order to have Esmin taken to the hospital by police or medical staff. And on June 18th, 2008, this was no different, other than the fact that the unthinkable was soon to happen with nobody even expecting it. On that early Wednesday morning at around 1 a.m., Esmin had finally gone to sleep for the day. She slept for just about an hour because it was around 2 a.m. when Esmin had woken up, and when she did, she began silently pacing around the apartment. Now, it was said that 4 days prior to this day, Esmin had moved out of her own apartment and moved in to stay with a woman named Pauline Robinson. Pauline was a friend of Esmin who lived not too far from the church, and Esmin had moved in with her because just a few weeks beforehand, Esmin had actually lost her job at the daycare center, and because of this, she also was soon forced to move out of her apartment. Esmin's friend Peter Pilgrim, who had actually saw her a few days prior, described how Esmin was apparently struggling quite bad because of this, and these struggles made her condition much worse than it already was. Pauline described how during those early hours on June 18th, Esmin was not doing too well, and she soon began trashing around Pauline's apartment. As Esmin was pacing around, she continued growing more and more concerned, and at some point, she just felt that she needed to leave and go speak to Pastor Marilyn at that moment. And that's why at 4 a.m. in the morning, Esmin ended up leaving the home and began searching for Marilyn. After 40 minutes spent outside, Esmin finally arrived at Marilyn's home, and she just started knocking on the door until it was answered. And it was when Marilyn opened the door when Esmin immediately began begging her for God's forgiveness. Esmin said to Marilyn, quote, "Oh, Pastor, my soul is in trouble. I need forgiveness before I die, or I will have no mercy." At that moment, Pastor Marilyn did not hesitate to not only forgive her, but console her. She told Esmin that God had forgiven her and that it was going to be okay. But despite the efforts, this, however, was not enough to calm Esmin's panic, and she continued loudly crying out that she needed forgiveness and that her soul was in trouble. The volume of the ordeal was in fact so loud, it had actually woken up Marilyn's neighbors, and in the midst of the commotion, Marilyn told Esmin, like, "Hey, I'm going to be heading back inside to quickly change my clothes. I'll be back in just a second." Now, Esmin was still very upset as she was waiting outside for Marilyn to come back. But what she didn't know was that Marilyn had actually gone inside to quickly call 911. When they answered, Marilyn expressed how concerned she was for Esmin, and she urged them that they needed to come and help her. And soon enough, police and an emergency services van arrived and got Esmin loaded into the van to take her to a hospital for psychiatric treatment. Marilyn really wanted to go in with her. She was very concerned for Esmin and just wanted to be there to especially help her feel at ease. But despite wanting to go with her, Marilyn knew that the psychiatric emergency room, which they called the G building, was different from the typical emergency room. It was said that in the G building, once patients were brought in, they were taken to a separate area, and that's all you'd be able to see of them. And so Marilyn knew that she unfortunately wouldn't have been allowed to wait there with Esmin. When police and emergency services arrived, Esmin was contrastingly calm, and she was escorted to the van with no resistance. And Marilyn watched as Esmin did a gesture she did often, tapping her head 3 times, looking up to the sky, saying, "Jesus, Jesus, Jesus," before the van drove off with Esmin inside. The van brought Esmin into Kings County Hospital Center, or KCHC, in Brooklyn. And just some background, this hospital appeared to be not the best one, if you will. Throughout the 2000s, the Kings County Hospital was slapped with multiple lawsuits. I mean, some people literally nicknamed the hospital Killer County based on the alleged conditions they witnessed there. And there was one specific lawsuit that was mentioned throughout the media coverage of Esmin's case and is still somewhat ongoing today. And it's seriously just ridiculous the things that were listed on this suit of the hospital doing. On May 2nd, 2007, a lawsuit was filed against New York City Health and Hospitals, which is the parent company of Kings County Hospital, with several different claims. This suit was filed by the New York Civil Liberties Union, or NYCLU, the Mental Hygiene and Legal Services, or MHLS, legal team, alongside a few others. In this suit, they claimed that the hospital staff working in the psychiatric unit were careless and neglectful, and that the overall waiting room and inpatient treatment areas of the psychiatric unit were dirty and in bad condition. The psychiatric unit was actually described in the lawsuit as, quote, "a chamber of filth, decay, indifference, and danger. The suit also cites an issue with overcrowding, leaving the patients unfortunate enough to be in the hospital with very little care. The case included 7 former patients and victims in the original suit, and one of the victims included was a disabled individual who recounted their stay as an inpatient in the psychiatric hospital. They said that they were treated extremely poorly, and when they were in the hospital and asked if they could call their family, the staff just started outright laughing at them. Others listed in the case were not as explicitly explained, but that incident alone is enough to get the point across that this hospital had some questionable and very concerning behavior going on. This case was very much still underway when Esmin's case occurred, and with all of this happening, her mistreatment was unfortunately added into the mix. On that morning of June 18th, 2008, Esmin was taken to KCHC by emergency services at around 6:30 a.m. When she arrived at the hospital, she was changed into a hospital gown and was made to sit in the psychiatric unit's waiting room. And due to her previous visits at KCHC, her records from these prior admissions were available to the hospital's medical staff. At the time of her arrival, staff members were nearing the end of the night shift. However, this was the first of 4 shifts that Esmin would soon spend in the hospital for the next 24 hours. And so I'll be referring to this shift as the first shift and the subsequent shifts 2, 3, and 4 as the respective shifts. The first shift was between the hours 12 a.m. to 8 a.m. And it was during this first shift when Esmin was greeted by a senior nurse named Gonzalo. And Nurse Gonzalo would be the one to conduct the initial screening or triage of Esmin. It's during this screening when Nurse Gonzalo would classify Esmin as a priority 2 high priority patient under the CPEP triage protocol. With the CPEP protocol, it was required that after Esmin arrived at the hospital, her name was supposed to be added to what they called a 24-hour observation sheet. And this sheet is essentially a document where it's required that on an hourly or just a frequent basis that nursing staff at the CPEP are required to note any observations of the patients there. During the first shift, the person who was responsible for adding any incoming patients to the 24-hour observation sheet was a senior nurse named Bernadita Calbildo. This role was tasked to her as she was the head nurse during the first shift. And this meant that when arriving at the hospital, Esmin was supposed to be noted into this document. But for some reason, despite this protocol the CPEP had, Esmin was not added to the June 18th 24-hour observation sheet, which Nurse Calbildo later on testified as being the result of an overlook. Now, shortly after Esmin was assessed by Nurse Gonzalo, she was then briefly seen by a resident on call. And the resident on call noted Esmin's previous psychiatric history and also noted that she was, quote, pacing, restless, and crying out loud in the hallway. Because of this, the resident on call prescribed Esmin with 2 milligrams of Ativan. This is one of the anti-anxiety medications that I mentioned earlier. And not too long after, at around 6:55 a.m., the resident on call ordered for Esmin to be fully evaluated by the next available psychiatrist. Now, not too long went by when 8 a.m. came and the second shift was starting at the hospital, which would last until 5 p.m. And it was during this shift, sometime between 9 a.m. and 11 a.m., when Esmin was psychiatrically evaluated by 2 doctors, 1 a psychologist and 2 an attending physician named Dr. Thomas Coach. During the evaluation, Esmin was apparently agitated, suspicious, and paranoid, and she was talking to herself saying that she thought she lost her soul. It was then when Dr. Coach and the psychologist diagnosed Esmin with psychosis and schizophrenia. Now, at some point, the psychologist ended up calling Pauline Robinson, which, as a reminder, is the woman who Esmin had moved in with 4 days prior. And it was during this phone call Pauline told the psychologist all about how Esmin was feeling and how she was trashing the apartment before being taken to the hospital. By 11:15 a.m., in accordance with New York Mental Health Law Section 9.39, Dr. Coach had formally ordered for Esmin to be involuntarily admitted to KCHC's inpatient service. According to KCHC's protocol, one of the steps that's mandatory before patients are able to be transferred from the emergency room to the inpatient psychiatric hospital is that they must have a medical examination conducted. conducted. And so about 25 minutes later, at around 11:40 a.m., Dr. Coach made written orders stating that Esmin needed to have a full medical examination done, some blood work done, and that she also needed an EKG. During the second shift at the CPEP, the attending physician responsible for conducting medical examinations on patients was Dr. Rashid Abedin. And of these patients who needed an exam included Esmin. But kind of similar to the nurse not adding her to the observation sheet, Dr. Abedin did not perform neither a medical examination, an EKG, nor blood work on Esmin, which he later on went to testify saying that he did in fact make 3 attempts to examine Esmin, however was, quote, blocked from doing so because she was uncooperative, which he did in fact note in Esmin's record that this happened at 1 p.m. The thing is, after looking at the security footage, it did show that Esmin was in fact waving her hands at Dr. Abedin and refusing to talk to him, and that he did attempt to speak with her, but the video not only showed that he only made 2 attempts, not 3, but it also showed that these attempts were made at 2:30 p.m. and 4:45 p.m., not 1 p.m. like he had listed in the notes. There was no interaction with him and Esmin between 9:45 a.m. and 1 p.m. that day, and those 2 attempts that he did make to examine her weren't even listed in his notes. Now, could be said that this seemed to be more related to a lack of clear policy or training from the hospital on what to do in this particular situation, as court records state, quote, with respect to the procedure for handling how to proceed with a patient who is blocking and refusing the necessary treatment, Dr. Abedin testified that there was no clear policy. But what happened next was very startling, because eventually Dr. Abedin was able to perform an assessment on Esmin, as he was in fact able to complete a deep vein thrombosis and pulmonary emboli risk assessment on her. He was able to get this examination completed in the CPEP computer, and from this assessment, he generated a low risk score for Esmin. But you want to know what's very interesting about this assessment? Was the fact that Dr. Abedin conducted and filled out this assessment without actually examining her. He did not physically or directly examine Esmin to fill out this assessment. Instead, it was said, quote, Dr. Abedin testified that the information that he relied on to make this risk assessment was data regarding Miss Green that was already in the CPEP computer from Miss Green's previous admissions, and his observations of her physical condition and demeanor from seeing her in the CPEP hallway without actually examining her. So yes, Esmin was placed at a low risk score for deep vein thrombosis and pulmonary emboli based on no actual physical examination. Now, Dr. Abedin last attempted to physically examine Esmin at 4:45 p.m., which would have just been before the start of the 3rd shift or the evening shift, which would be starting at 5 p.m. and lasting until 12 a.m. By the time the 3rd shift started, Esmin had already been at the CPEP for nearly 12 hours, still with no medical examination done. And this time, the physicians responsible for conducting this medical examination of CPEP patients were Dr. Dimitru Magardishin and Dr. David Estes. Dr. Magardishin was the first physician on duty at the CPEP at the start of the 3rd shift at 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. as he was covering for Dr. Estes. And he only stayed on duty until 7 p.m. before Dr. Estes arrived to take over. Now, with Esmin having no medical examinations done at all, she needed to have one done during the 3rd shift. But contrastingly to at least 2 attempts to medically examine Esmin being done in the 2nd shift, during the 3rd shift, there were absolutely no attempts from anyone to conduct a medical examination on Esmin. During those 2 hours, Dr. Magardishin was on duty, while Esmin would pace up and down the hallways. He was in fact occupied with patients and other tasks, and he did in fact notice and walked past Esmin multiple times in the CPEP's main hallway. However, during each of those several times he walked past her, he didn't make eye contact with her, let alone medically examine her. And even when Dr. Estes came and was on duty, he also didn't make any attempts to examine her, despite individual members of the CPEP nursing staff being assigned to perform tests such as EKGs and blood works on Esmin. There were no records in Esmin's file that any of these tests were even attempted to be done. And it would be at around 8:30 p.m. when Esmin would enter into the women's waiting room, where she would remain being outside of camera view until 5:29 a.m. the next morning. The attending physician who was on duty at the CPEP during the 4th shift was again Dr. Estes. And during the entirety of the night shift, which started at 12 a.m., Esmin had, quote, no contact with any doctors and received little attention from the nursing staff. During this time, Dr. Estes again didn't perform nor attempt to perform a medical examination of Esmin. Likewise, despite being assigned to do so, the nursing staff also didn't take Esmin's vitals, nor did they perform an EKG or do any blood work during this 4th shift. Instead, what happened was that Esmin stayed inside the women's waiting room for over 9 hours. And during that time period, not even one doctor working at the hospital had entered the room. The only staff to enter the room were nurses Gonzalo, a senior nurse named Adelaida Sarmiento Villaroman, and a 3rd CPEP nurse. On the first occasion, the 3 nurses entered the women's waiting room at 12:43 a.m., over 4 hours since Esmin entered the room. But not a lot happened because they quickly exited 2 minutes later. These nurses had clipboards in their hands, and throughout this time, they were just going from area to area throughout the CPEP. A few hours later, as Esmin was still in the women's waiting room, Nurse Gonzalo was sitting in the corridor doing some paperwork. It was then at approximately 4:45 a.m. when she walked down the corridor into the main waiting room, and then again into the women's waiting room where Esmin was. Thing is, Nurse Gonzalo didn't stay in there for 2 minutes this time. She didn't even stay in there for 1 minute. No, she was in and out of there in 15 seconds. And afterwards, she just returned back to where she had been doing her paperwork. For both of these instances, Nurse Gonzalo noted on the June 19th 24-hour observation log that Esmin was observed to be asleep during the hours between midnight to 1 a.m. and the hours between 4 a.m. to 5 a.m. There were no other checks on Esmin throughout the night, despite the extended amount of time she spent in the women's waiting room. It wouldn't be until about 5:29 a.m. on that Thursday morning when Esmin would exit the women's waiting room. And when she stepped out of the room, she went and approached a nursing station window. Now, sitting across the hallway from her was a security guard. And when Esmin approached this window, she in fact spoke to the security guard. I'm not sure what was discussed, but what I do know was that this conversation was very brief. And it was after this quick discussion, only 2 minutes later at 5:31 a.m., when Esmin went inside the main waiting room and sat in a chair. The main waiting room was about 16 by 11 feet, and once Esmin got inside the waiting room, she sat down in a chair. Now, where she was sitting was not only right in front of the security substation, but it was also approximately 20 feet diagonally across from the registration area, which also was fronted with clear glass. And just a trigger warning, I'm about to describe what happened once she sat in the chair. This might be difficult to hear for many, so please feel free to skip this part during this timestamp or listen at your own discretion. Now, it's said that once she sat down, only about a minute went by when Esmin looked at the TV, stretched her legs out, and put her hands in her lap. Her head then began to lower, and at 5:32 a.m., Esmin's left arm went limp and she collapsed onto the floor. Now, you would think that this would get noticed by some staff member and actions would be taken to ensure Esmin was okay. But unfortunately, that was far from what happened next. It would be an entire 31 minutes. Esmin would lay motionless on the floor, face down, and with her head just a little bit under the chair. And it would be 6:03 a.m. when Esmin's body began convulsing. She underwent a series of approximately 29 spasmodic movements, with the main movements occurring in her left leg. And these movements went on for an entire 5 minutes. The last movement stopped at 6:08 a.m. And by then, Esmin's body was on the ground, face down, and motionless. By that point, with Esmin lying face down on the floor, you would certainly think any person who is able and especially works there would see this woman lying on the floor and think, it's odd that this patient at this hospital is lying on the floor face down and motionless right now. Maybe I should get up and go see if she's okay. Better yet, maybe I should go page a doctor because I'm concerned. But for some reason, that is very beyond me. Esmin laid on the floor for almost an entire 30 minutes, and not one person went up to even check on her in that instance. You want to know what happened instead? Not one, not two, but at least 3 staff members saw Esmin lying on the floor and did absolutely nothing. And one of these people actually included a doctor. Once Esmin was completely motionless on the floor, it was caught on camera that at least 2 security guards and 1 doctor looked into the main waiting room in the same direction that Esmin was lying on the floor. In fact, the 2 security guards actually looked into the room directly at Esmin multiple times. One of them even wheeled his swivel chair over to the main waiting room's entrance, stayed seated, looked directly at Esmin, and then wheeled himself right out of the area, doing absolutely nothing. In the video, you can see that there were also various other individuals who were not associated with the hospital who were also in the main waiting room whilst Esmin was collapsed on the floor. These individuals appeared to be a mixture of possibly other patients or family members. And the video showed several of these individuals going in and out of the waiting room and also getting up to speak into the reception area glass window, still as Esmin laid motionless on the floor. Regarding the people, I do think them not doing anything could likely be from the simple fact that, one, not only do they not work there, so technically it's not their responsibility, but two, it could be the fact that these people saw a security guard and even a doctor look into the room at Esmin on the ground and do nothing. So realistically, if the doctor did nothing, then maybe they thought everything was fine. Also, considering that some too were also patients, they might not have understood the severity or even been well enough to make that call. But who should have been well enough to make that call were the security guards, and especially the doctor, who, despite looking directly at Esmin, still ended up moving away. It wasn't until about 6:35 a.m. when Nurse Villaroman had entered the main waiting room and finally went to check on Esmin. And when she saw Esmin on the floor, instead of simply leaning down and maybe lightly tapping Esmin to see if she would wake up, what Nurse Villaroman instead decided to do was, quote, use her foot to nudge Esmin. She literally used her foot to try checking if a human being was responsive. By that point, once she realized that Esmin was unresponsive, that is the exact moment she would have needed to stop what she was doing and start doing CPR or start doing some kind of life-saving measures. But what Nurse Villaroman instead did was alert Nurse Gonzalo. And Nurse Gonzalo, instead of her then initiating CPR, she apparently then alerted Senior Nurse Bernadita Cabildo. And I'm unsure what Nurse Cabildo did at that point, but it was only a few minutes later at 6:40 a.m. when Dr. Estes arrived by Esmin's side and he began starting the life-saving measures on her before being joined by the members of the KCHC code team, the New York City Fire Department, and emergency medical services to help. It would be an entire 30 minutes where the team would attempt to revive Esmin, but their efforts unfortunately would fail. And it was 7:10 a.m. on June 19th, 2009, after 24 hours of waiting and nearly an hour of being on the floor, when Dr. Estes would pronounce Esmin dead. Esmin's passing soon caused panic in the hospital staff, especially for those on the medical board. And shortly later, a coroner was tasked with determining the final cause of death for Esmin, as it seemed to have happened out of nowhere. As the autopsy was taking place, psychologists reviewed evidence and testimony that had been told to them by Esmin and her loved ones. They determined that Esmin was suffering from chronic paranoid schizophrenia. And after conducting an autopsy, the New York City chief medical examiner concluded that Esmin's official cause of death was pulmonary emboli caused by deep venous thrombosis. In other words, her official cause of death was from migration of blood clots from her legs to her lungs, which, by the way, if you remember, was the same thing she scored a low risk on during the assessment that wasn't even physically done or conducted on her during the second shift. And they determined that the untreated blood clots had actually exacerbated the chronic paranoid schizophrenia that Esmin had. This might come as a surprise, but it's actually not uncommon to see situations in which patients with schizophrenia had blood clots or other lethal heart or circulatory issues. It's said that over 2/3 of people with schizophrenia actually end up passing away from coronary heart disease. And this isn't just limited to the heart in general, but also to blood-related problems. Also, it's said those with schizophrenia are 2 to 3 times more likely to pass away early than the general population. And these truly are just very alarming statistics. Many studies have discussed the various links between coagulation issues and schizophrenia. And a lot of these studies, they highlight the obvious causes while also discussing potential other reasons behind the connection. The first and simplest link between schizophrenia and blood clots specifically is inactivity. The severe depressive episodes caused by schizophrenia can cause extreme levels of inactivity spanning several weeks at a time. And the thing about inactivity is that it can contribute to blood clots forming. When we partake in any kind of physical activity, our muscles contract to cause skeletal movement. Now, we have veins in our lower bodies, and in these veins, our blood is meant to travel in one direction, which is upwards to the heart. Now, because the blood has to go upwards, that means it's moving against gravity. And in order to prevent it from flowing back downwards, our veins have something called one-way valves. Now, these one-way valves are what help the blood flow in one direction. But nonetheless, with gravity being a factor, there still has to be a way to make blood flow upwards from the legs more efficiently. And that's where our muscle contraction comes in. When we partake in physical activity, our muscles contract to promote skeletal movement. But also while promoting movement, our muscles are also squeezing on our veins, which helps in pushing the blood back up to the heart. So when we take this into account, we know that if there's a lack of activity, that means that there would be a lack of muscle contractions, which would then lead to a slowing of the flow of our blood. And with this slowing of blood flow, this can contribute to the formation of blood clots. Anything that slows blood flow can contribute to blood clots. Esmin's story quickly blew up in the media and in the popular online spaces at the time. Many members of the local community, as well as people all over the nation, were outraged when confronted with the footage of Esmin collapsing on the ground and being blatantly left there to pass away. Several members of Esmin's family, including her eldest daughter, Tecia Harrison, and one of her sisters, Brenda James, flew to New York in order to speak out publicly against the hospital. There are many interviews in which Tecia spoke about her mother's kindness and resilience, and she was begging for the hospital to be brought to justice for what they'd done. And action was fortunately taken quickly. The day after Esmin passed away, 3 hospital workers were fired and 3 others were suspended, for a total of 6 workers of KCHC fired or suspended. The New York City Department of Investigation, or DOI, quickly began an investigation on this case. And to do this, they visited the CPEP on several occasions. This included one visit guided by a physician named Dr. Jorge Petit. Dr. Petit was hired as a consultant by New York City's Health and Hospital Corporation in January 2008, and he provided useful testimony during the investigation of this case. DOI gathered as much information as possible to create a detailed report. And in an article posted on June 19, 2009, on the same day just before DOI released the report, and exactly 1 year after Esmin passed, it was actually announced in an article that, quote, 2 doctors and 2 nurses are facing possible criminal charges for covering up the death by neglect of patient Esmin Green last year in the psychiatric ward at Kings County Hospital. And the names of these staff members included Nurse Gonzalo, nursing aide Easton Royal, Dr. Abedin, and Dr. Magardishan. Just a note, the DOI report had Easton Royal's name spelled out as Royal Easton, and this was how it was listed in a lot of the earlier sources, but most of the sources a couple years later referred to him as Easton Royal, so I assume there must have just been a mistake earlier that got corrected later on. I'm not sure, but based on this, I'll just be referring to him as Easton Royal. DOI found that their investigation revealed not only falsification of records and false testimony from Nurse Gonzalo and nursing aide Easton Royal, but also factual inconsistencies in several entries made by Drs. Abedin, Magardishan, Rubel, and Estes in Esmin's record. During the investigation, it was found that there were some major discrepancies found in the medical records and reports made by members of the care team at the hospital. Their investigation found not only fabricated records, but also found false testimonies, which were all included in an 18-page report on the case. DOI conducted interviews of several staff members of the hospital, and one of these staff members included Nurse Gonzalo. Now, when doing the investigation, DOI had to look at Esmin's records and the progress notes taken during her time in the hospital. And it was upon doing this search when they came across the progress notes that Nurse Gonzalo took for Esmin. Now, Nurse Gonzalo had 2 interviews at DOI, and during these interviews, she explained everything that happened from her point of view, and she told them all about the progress notes that she took for Esmin. The progress notes it appeared she made were at 6 a.m. and 6:30 a.m., and in these notes, she wrote how she saw Esmin at the time and that Esmin was looking just fine. Now, at both of those times that she wrote Esmin was looking fine, Esmin was in fact collapsed on the floor. and it was all captured on camera. But during the interview, Nurse Gonzalo changed the times and instead said that she saw Esmin at 5 a.m. and 5:30 a.m. and it was at those times Esmin was looking fine, implying that the only thing that was inaccurate from the notes was the time. Nurse Gonzalo also had marked vital signs for Esmin at 6:40 a.m., which she later testified were vital signs that Nurse Villaroman took before the code was called. But what Nurse Gonzalo didn't know was that the security footage would show otherwise, and she would get caught in 3 lies. Because 1, Esmin was not fine during any of those times. 2, Nurse Villaroman never took Esmin's vital signs. And 3, Nurse Gonzalo never checked on her during the times listed or even at all. Because instead what happened, and what Nurse Gonzalo later admitted to DOI, was that after Esmin was pronounced dead, she actually made 3 false entries in Esmin's progress notes, writing to make it appear as if she was checking in on Esmin within the 45 minutes before Nurse Villaroman discovered her on the floor. She wrote how Esmin was under her observation and that Esmin appeared to look fine despite any of this being far from the actual truth. And Nurse Gonzalo admitted to all of this, with the report saying, quote, Nurse Gonzalo, who feared she would lose her job, admitted to DOI that she fabricated portions of the entries in Miss Green's progress notes in order to mislead. Likewise, the report states that nursing aide Easton Royal had also made false entries regarding Esmin, and he did this in the 24-hour observation sheet for June 19, 2008. Easton was suspended immediately after Esmin's passing, and after that, he was said to have resigned from the job. Because in his notes, it indicated that for the hours of 5 a.m. to 6 a.m., as well as the hours of 6 a.m. to 7 a.m., that he observed Esmin to be asleep. But what Easton would later admit to the hospital officials is that during those 2 hours he filled out the document, he didn't observe Esmin at all. In fact, for the majority of the time, he was actually on break in the CPAP's registration area. So without even seeing Esmin for a literal 24-hour observation sheet, he just wrote that she was sleeping, when in actuality she was face down on the floor since 5:32 a.m. before being surrounded by doctors and nurses at 6:45 a.m. who were trying to revive her. And when issued a subpoena from DOI to provide testimony, Easton invoked his Fifth Amendment right, which protected him against self-incrimination through an attorney. Furthermore, the report revealed findings of factual inconsistencies in several entries made by Drs. Abedin, Magardishin, Rubel, and Estes in Esmin's record. For starters, Dr. Abedin, who, if we remember, was the attending physician responsible for conducting medical examinations on patients during the second shift Esmin was in the hospital. They found in a CPAP medical database form that Dr. Abedin wrote a statement that on June 18, 2008, at or before 1 p.m. that he attempted to medically examine Esmin. And in his testimony to DOI, he maintained the sentiment that he'd attempted to medically examine Esmin at or before 1 p.m. But of course, once DOI obtained the security footage, it was revealed that Dr. Abedin had no contact with Esmin whatsoever before 1 p.m. And when DOI asked him to return to explain that discrepancy, among other things, he invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, so didn't further speak on this. Next was Dr. Magardishin. Just a reminder, Dr. Magardishin was the first physician on duty during the start of the third shift that Esmin was at the hospital. Now, he wrote a statement in Esmin's CPAP medical database form that on June 18, 2008, at or before 6:45 p.m., he attempted to medically examine Esmin. But, like a common theme, the security footage showed that Dr. Magardishin had no contact with Esmin at or before 6:45 p.m. on that day. And again, like the others, Dr. Magardishin declined to give testimony to DOI after invoking his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination through an attorney. And the final two were Drs. Rubel and Dr. Estes. The both of them were found to have made entries in Esmin's progress notes that repeated some of the previous false statements made by Nurse Gonzalo in the progress note entries. In their notes, it was written that at 6 a.m. on June 19th, Esmin had been seen going to the bathroom. But of course, this was completely false because instead, at 6 a.m., Esmin had been on the floor in the same spot for almost 30 minutes at that point, and for another 30 minutes afterwards. Not only this, but their notes also included that normal vital signs had been measured on Esmin at 6:30 a.m. and 6:40 a.m., which was between the same exact time the nurse discovered her and the team had began trying to revive her. Now, at the time, DOI was unable to determine whether Dr. Rubel or Dr. Estes willingly repeated these false statements in their entries, knowing that they were false, or if it happened to be innocent innocently done after relying on Nurse Gonzalo's account. Either or, DOI ended up serving subpoenas on both of the doctors to get their testimony on what happened with the progress note entries. But again, they both declined to testify after invoking their Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination through their respective attorneys. It was after a second interview DOI had with Nurse Gonzalo when she testified that after Esmin passed away on the morning of June 19th, that she had actually saw one of the doctors take out a sheet of paper from Esmin's progress notes. And according to Nurse Gonzalo, this sheet supposedly contained entries that she made during the emergency code for Esmin. These included 2 entries that measured vital signs and 1 entry recording Esmin's passing. And when DOI both reviewed the records provided to them and made a specific quest for a search for this document, they in fact did not find the sheet of paper that Nurse Gonzalo described. Additionally, the doctor who Nurse Gonzalo said she saw take the record invoked his privilege against self-incrimination, so I'm unsure much about that. And with all of these findings, DOI's investigations revealed several gaps in Esmin's care during her stay at the hospital from June 18th to the 19th. Some of these observations included, number 1, Esmin was never medically examined during the 2nd, 3rd, or 4th shifts. Also, blood work and an EKG were never done despite being ordered by Dr. Koach during the 1st shift. The only doctor who was able to medically examine Esmin was Dr. Koach during the 1st shift, and the only other one who actually tried to make any type of attempt to examine Esmin despite the resistance was Dr. Abedin during the 2nd shift. The next 2 shifts during shift 3 and 4, none of the doctors showed the slightest bit of effort to try examining Esmin. Not only this, but Dr. Koach had ordered for Esmin to be given Risperdal during the 2nd shift. This was the exact same medication she was given during her 3 prior stays at the hospital. But despite the order being placed, she was not given any medications during the 2nd shift, nor was she given anything during the 3rd shift or the 4th shifts either. In addition to this, after her triage, nobody took Esmin's vital signs. She was not listed on the 24-hour observation sheet, and for more than a 10-hour period from 8:30 p.m. to 6:42 a.m. after she was found, Esmin received absolutely no attention from a physician and received very little attention from nursing staff. And it wasn't that staff members were overwhelmed with work or patients, because they were actually not that busy at all. Throughout the night shift, many of the nurses were able to do things such as taking long breaks or even doubling up with other nurses to do duties like sitting outside of the room of a child patient who was sleeping. Take Nurse Gonzalo, for example. There was a point where she spent more than half an hour having dinner with Nurse Calbildo, as well as others inside of the nursing station. There was a point where she then spent nearly 1 hour sitting outside a child patient's room chatting and having either coffee or tea with Nurse Calbildo. There was another point. She spent approximately an hour sitting next to a security guard at an area of the hospital called the Y intersection while doing paperwork. And lastly, towards the end of the shift, Nurse Gonzalo spent nearly an hour on break in a closed triage room with Nurse Calbildo, which also happened to be within the same exact time frame when Esmin collapsed in the main waiting room and laid on the floor for over an hour. Regarding the few amount of checks that they did, during the interviews by DOI, medical and nursing staff actually testified that it was standard practice that during the night shift, they didn't wake up a patient who was sleeping. And it was said that they would delay previously ordered procedures such as blood work or EKGs or vitals until 7 a.m. in the morning. This was also confirmed by Dr. Pettit, who testified that he understood that it wasn't custom for medical clearances, including medical review, blood tests, and EKGs to be performed at the CPEP during the evening or night shifts if patients were asleep. But even regarding organizational issues, another huge problem was the fact that there was an issue with fragmented medical records. There was not one person in the hospital who had the entirety of Esmin's medical files. For some reason at the time, Esmin's records had been fragmented, and because of this, nobody fully knew what was going on with her. And regarding the lack of treatment they provided for Esmin, another huge problem was the fact that the hospital had no policy in place for handling situations in which they needed to do medical consultations with uncooperative patients. Dr. Pettit testified that sometime after he arrived at KCHC in January 2008, he noticed that there were medical clearance issues regarding patient care flow at the CPEP, specifically regarding, quote, how far we could go to force a patient refusing a medical exam. Not only this, but there was no standardized tracking of staff in the CPEP at the time, and it was often difficult to tell who was where at what times. And then when you get into the monitoring aspect, there was just a lack of use of the cameras in the nursing station, which obviously caused many issues. They had computers in the nursing station, and the live video cameras caught everything that was happening. If it was monitored, this could have been used to help prevent Esmin's passing. The thing is, video monitoring was not a task assigned to any of the staff members in the hospital at the time, and so none of the staff members used the video monitors to keep an eye on patients in the waiting room at that time. So there clearly was a plethora of things that went wrong and could have been avoided if 1, some staff members were just a little bit more competent, and 2, if the hospital had proper systems in place. And a lot of these issues that they had were only changed after the fact of Esmin passing. Some of these reform measures and corrective actions included changes they made in leadership over KCHC and the CPEP. On February 2nd, 2009, they hired both a new admin of behavioral health services and also a new executive director of KCHC. In addition to these new roles, they hired more than 300 new staff to fill various different roles at the hospital. This included physicians, psychiatrists, nurses, social workers, activity therapists, peer counselors, and a new role of behavioral health associates. In November 2008, they actually removed hospital police from the CPEP to instead be replaced with 15 specially trained behavioral health associates. This to ensure that there are professionals there who know better on how to approach a patient who may be resistant or uncooperative. Dr. Pettit also testified that there is now a written policy in place regarding protocol on how to handle medical examinations of uncooperative patients. Likewise, they made changes to improve the CPEP triage and organization. Some of these included having patients arriving at the psychiatric emergency services to be promptly seen by a triage nurse, in addition to having a preliminary assessment by a psychiatrist on average within an hour of the patient's arriving. This, in addition to making sure that each patient is checked every 15 minutes by clinical staff and evaluated every hour by a registered nurse. Likewise, they implemented a 24/7 rapid response team to be available in the CPEP, especially when accounting for the fact that they weren't really checking on patients during the night shifts. Dr. Pettit testified that now there was a, quote, more sense that we are an emergency room 24/7, and that there were more efforts made in the hospital to perform procedures in shorter time frames. They also created a new quality management division for behavioral health. They implemented an electronic medical record, or EMR, for psychiatric patients at the hospital to help in providing access to patients' records and help improvements in tracking, especially to avoid cases like Esmin where her records were for some reason fragmented. And finally, on February 8th, 2009, they also added a new behavioral health pavilion, which cost a total of $153 million to make. The psychiatric emergency department and inpatient units were 70 years old at the time, but with this money, they were able to replace it with a state-of-the-art behavioral health pavilion. The above changes were in response to not only Esmin's passing, but also that suit I mentioned prior with the NYCLU and MHLS in May of 2007. The changes were done practically immediately as the pressure from the public outrage towards the hospital was extremely high. In 2010, the judge ruled that certain changes must be made to Kings County Hospital's operations, and the judge ended up putting them under a 5-year monitor. And just that next year, on May 16, 2011, it was actually confirmed by a few sources that one of the staff members had been charged with reckless endangerment and falsifying records in Esmin's case. And this indictment named the nursing aide Easton Royal, who wrote in Esmin's chart that she was asleep even though she was not. Regarding the other staff members, it was said by an official that despite the several doctors and nurses being investigated, that, quote, the charges against Mr. Royal were likely to be the only ones. And even a spokesperson on behalf of Esmin said that they, quote, would not say if any other hospital employees are likely to be indicted. So from what I can find, the only person who was allegedly charged was the nursing aide, Easton Royal, and it was said that he could be facing up to 11 years in prison. But I unfortunately couldn't find anything else on how the case continued or anything regarding sentencing, and it's unknown and supposedly unlikely that anyone else was charged in this case. To remember Esmin, on June 19th, 2009, the local community hosted hosted a candlelit vigil for her. This vigil was held outside of the KCHC as a protest to the hospital and the staff that were responsible, including the many that had been fired at that point. Their main goal was to remember Esmin and to continue to hold the hospital accountable for her murder by neglect. In terms of getting some kind of justice for Esmin, Esmin's family filed a lawsuit against the hospital seeking $25 million in damages caused by Esmin's passing. In the following media clip, the family's attorney, Sanford Rubenstein, speaks out regarding the family's mindset and the settlement, saying,
And the autopsy report, which has been released, showed that the cause of death were blood clots that went from her leg to her lungs. Had she been treated in a timely fashion, examined and treated, she very well may have lived, because she could have been given anticoagulation drugs, she could have been given compression stockings, and she could have been told to walk around. Had she been examined and treated, she may very well have been alive today.
And in regards to the family's wants, Rubenstein shared the following.
I have to tell you, I was with them when they saw the tape, and it was horribly distressing. But what they want more than anything else is change, that policies be implemented at hospitals, not just in New York City, but all over the country, so this never happens to another family, and that the cover-up be prosecuted by criminal authorities.
Now, even though the family had originally asked for $25 million in the initial lawsuit, they ultimately settled with the hospital for $2 million in May of 2009. In a New York Times article, it was shared that at her funeral in early July 2008, all 132 seats of the Jesus is Lord sanctuary were filled with friends, family, and church members who were considered a second family to Esmin. She was loved on all fronts and deeply cherished and celebrated by those in attendance. Interviews held with some of the funeral attendees share that she was a beautiful person, wholly dedicated to her beloved children. Yet her passing was not a warm one. She didn't pass away surrounded by the children she worked so hard to support, nor the members of her church who had filled that void in her heart for the past 8-9 years. She passed away alone, surrounded by strangers who did not care if she lived or died, face down on the cold, dirty floor of a hospital that should not have still been open. It was a cruel, avoidable, and undignified death for a woman who, despite dealing with mental illness, shared love and light with those around her. And the tragedy of it is compounded by how many times this undignified passing was shown on TV, YouTube, and other avenues. While it does paint a picture of the neglect she faced in those last moments, it's hard imagining having an image of yourself in that state in your final moments spread around in the same way. Though her passing did spark positive change, what happened to her should not have had to happen just for the hospital to make any changes. She should not have been waiting for over 24 hours. She should not have been ignored on the ground. Her blood clots could and should have also been caught in time based on how many times she was in and out of the hospital. And while it is important that new policies were put in place, it is unfortunate knowing that issues like this still continue to happen as a result of incompetence, lack of policy, or those lacking empathy, period. This case really just opens up discussion about so many issues that are so important. For example, the mistreatment that's said to often occur towards psychiatric patients, the stigma of mental health amongst Black communities, in particular those who are Caribbean, the mistreatment of those in poverty, and even just the mistreatment of women, specifically Black women in medical settings. It's sad that it was said that Esmin felt embarrassed for others to find out about her having a mental illness. Though with the stigma associated with mental health, especially within Black communities, it's fully understandable. There is often a large association of people feeling shame regarding mental illness. And not even just from research, but speaking from personal experience, this has had a lot of impact on Black communities as a whole. And this does make it difficult for those to deal with the struggles they're going through. Just for context, a study conducted by Ottawa Public Health revealed that 66% of participants believed that most people look at those affected with mental illness as less than, and 40% believed that seeking treatment was a sign of failure. The study also showed that 25% of Black Canadians were less likely to seek mental health treatments. And in the States, studies show that about 25% of Black individuals actually seek mental health treatment in comparison to 40% of their white counterparts. And there's many reasons for this barrier, including a general distrust in medical systems, especially rooted from previous events like the Tuskegee syphilis study, for example, past personal experiences faced, lack of diversity in healthcare, or even from things like lack of access. And there's just a lot of stigma against those with schizophrenia in general. And this seriously has major impacts on a lot of patients' quality of life, social relationships, and just overall treatment by society. There's just a lot of gaps, and I feel as though this could be a whole video in itself, so I'm not going to go too deep into it, but I do think it is something to keep in mind and to be aware about, especially after coming across a case such as this one. It's absolutely disgusting how Esmin was treated, and it's unfortunate how common it is for psychiatric patients to get mistreated and for Black patients to feel as though they're not heard. Today, Kings County Hospital remains open, and although there hasn't been any more nationally noted incidents at the location, there still are plenty of negative reviews that are rolling in here and there regarding the staff at the hospital. So only time will tell if the hospital will truly rise to the standard that all hospitals should be, and most importantly, doesn't allow someone else to pass as Esmin was allowed to. Esmin did not deserve what happened to her, and she shall be remembered as a woman who loved and was loved and worked hard to make sure her children and those she loved were provided for. But yes, that is it for today's case. Please let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any other videos on medical cases, crime, and mysteries. Bye now.